Before we start, do you guys have a question or a clarification? All right, so an answer coming from Mr. Eda. How about the others?
None, sir.
None din, sir.
None, sir.
All right. Sure, ah? Kanina pa kayo none. Anyway, so really hope so that you guys understood completely the topics that we are discussing right now. Okay, so this is where we've stopped a while ago. So V sub O is equal to V sub B plus V sub B. So again, during the negative half cycle, so if this is negative and then this one is positive, so negative is connected to the positive side and then positive is connected to the negative side. So V sub I is in reverse bias. But for V sub B, for our bias voltage, so negative is connected to the negative and then positive is connected to the positive. So as a result, our bias voltage will make this one a forward bias. Okay, so the formula for that one is VB plus VD. So as you can see right here, as it passes through here, okay, so you have to deduct the voltage threshold of the diode itself. So VB is negative, and then VD is positive, right? So here's the graph for this series negative clipper with negative bias. So you will see later on why we have this kind of graph. So completely conducting on the positive side, and then it was clipped partially on our negative cycle. Okay, so let's have an example for that one. So series negative clipper with positive bias, and then it's our diode is in ideal. So positive is connected to the positive, negative is connected to the negative. And the negative is connected to the negative, positive to positive. So as you can see, our V sub I and then our bias voltage is both in forward bias. So as a result, this ideal diode will completely and close switch. So as a result, now you have to deal with yes. Is there someone who speak? Anyway, so as a result, okay, you have to deal on everything, okay, with our voltages, our V sub I, V sub B, and then the threshold voltage of the diode. So we have here the formula. So V sub I is in positive, and then the ideal diode or the threshold voltage of the ideal is of course 0. So just put there 0. And then for the bias voltage, it's positive 2 volts. Okay, so if you do the math, so 5 minus 0 plus 2 is 7 volts. Okay, that is during the positive half cycle. And then for the negative half cycle, so as you can see right here, negative is connected to the positive, positive is connected to the negative. Okay, so the same with this one, bias voltage. So nothing has changed. So negative is still connected to the negative, and then positive is connected to the positive. So as you can see right here, our V sub I will be always in reverse bias. Okay, why is that so? Because our V sub I is greater than V sub 2. So the only time that our V sub 2 or our bias voltage will conduct during the first 2 voltages. Why? Because during the positive 3 volts, our V sub I now is greater, okay, or the negative 3 volts onwards is greater than the bias voltage. So if this one is greater than the bias voltage, so this will be in reverse bias. But at the point that this one is on par with our initial voltage, so for the first 2 voltages, so it will conduct a voltage because this one will make the diode a forward bias. Okay, so yeah, so this is our first 2 voltages, and then the remaining The -3, -4, and the -5 will be completely 0. Okay, so as a result, you have to deal with bias voltage and then the threshold diode or voltage threshold of the diode. So -2 plus 0.7 is equal to -1.3 volts. Okay, so -1.3 volts up to this point. Then onwards will be in reverse bias. Okay, so 7 volts for the positive and then -1.3 volts for the negative half cycle. Okay, so moving on, if we have ideal, we also have non-ideal. So the same example with the example number 11, it's just that we have now to consider the threshold voltage of our silicon. So I will skip the explanation now regarding with this one. It's just that you have to change this one into 0.7. So before it's 0, and right now you have to make it 0.7 because it's now in silicon diode. So 5 minus 0.7 plus 2. So just do the math, then you will get 6.3 volts. Okay. The same with our negative half cycle. It's just that this silicon diode now is not in 0 volts. So before we have, oops, why is that? Okay, correction. So for the example number 11, so this one is in ideal. So this one should be 0. Okay. So 2 minus 0 is -2 volts. So save. Okay, so sorry for that one. But for this one, since this one now is a silicon diode, so it's right here, so you have to deduct the voltage threshold of the diode, which is 0.7. So -2 plus 0.7 is -1.3 volts. So for the positive, we have 6.3 volts. And then for the negative, we have -1.3 volts. Okay. So next one is the shunt or parallel positive clipper. Okay, so shunt is actually just another terminology, but this one is a parallel positive clipper. Okay, so don't get confused on the word shunt. So shunt is similar with parallel. Okay, so a parallel clipper circuit uses the same diode theory and circuit operation. So a resistor and diode are connected in series with input signal, and the output signal is developed across the diode. The output is in parallel with the diode. Hence, the circuit name parallel clipper can limit either positive or negative alternation of the input signal. So figure below shows the circuit of a shunt positive clipper. So we only have two things that need to be considered when it comes to parallel positive clipper. So it provides output if the diode is in reverse bias. And then no output if the diode is in forward bias. So as you can see right here, it is the complete opposite of our series clipper. So in series clipper, it will only give you a voltage output if it's in forward bias, but in parallel clipper, so it will not give you a voltage or a voltage output if it's in a forward bias. So this will only give you an output if it's in reverse bias. Why is that so? Because take a look on this one. So let's say we have a positive half cycle. So positive connected to the positive, negative connected to the negative. So as you can see right here, it will never reach our V sub O because we have a complete loop in here. So positive, positive, negative to negative. So this is in forward bias. So we're now going to have a loop in here. Okay. So it will never reach to our V sub O. Okay. Our only provided output in this one is the voltage threshold of the diode, which is 0.7 if it's silicon or 0.3 if it's germanium. But if this one is in ideal diode, then 0. We have 0 voltage output on this one. But if it's negative here and then positive here, negative to positive and then positive to negative, so as you can see, this one will become an open circuit. So as a result, our voltage input will not loop through our voltage diode or through our diode. So as a result, it will pass through our voltage output. Okay, going back to our ground. So if it's in reverse bias, that's the only time that it will provide a voltage output. Okay, so that is why it will not conduct, or it will not give you, it will still conduct, okay, but it will not give you an output if it's in forward bias. Okay, it will only give you an output if this one is reverse bias. Okay, so with this arrangement, okay, with this arrangement of the diode, so this one is clipping the positive side. So just flip this one, and then that one now is clipping the negative side. Okay. So that depends on the polarity of your diode. But for this one, it clips the positive side. That's why we call that one parallel positive clipper, because it's clipping the positive side of the circuit. Okay, so for you to appreciate this one, we have here an example. So shunt or parallel positive clipper, wherein our diode is in ideal diode. So positive is connected to the positive, negative is connected to the negative. So this one is in forward bias during the positive half cycle. So as you can see, there will be no voltage output on this one. So our only voltage output is our threshold voltage, wherein our threshold voltage is 0 because of course it's in ideal, and then the other one is the bias voltage. So as you can see right here, we don't have bias voltage yet since it's not part on the circuit. But if ever that there's a bias voltage, then you have to include that one. But in here, since we don't have that bias voltage, so just put here 0. So 0 plus 0 is 0 volts. And then during the negative half cycle, so as you can see right here, negative now is connected to the positive, and then positive is connected to the negative. So as a result, this diode now will become in reverse bias, wherein our voltage input now will pass through our V sub O. So V sub O now is equal to V sub I, okay, because there is no other, other component that is in here, only the V sub I, which is of course negative 5 volts. Okay, so here's the graph for that one, for the example number 13. So for the positive side, it's completely 0. And then for the negative cycle, we have negative 5 volts. Any questions so far? Yes? Question?
None, sir.
All right. So as you can see right here, this one, the parallel circuit is much more simpler when it comes to, computing the V sub O. Because, this part, the parallel side will be completely neglected if this one is in reverse bias. Wherein if it's in reverse bias, the only thing that you're going to deal with is this initial voltage, and then if there's another voltages in here, which is have to add or deduct that one. But for this one, since we don't have any other voltages, so V sub O is equal to V sub I already in here. Right, so anyway, so let's move on. For the example 14, so instead of having an ideal, we now have non-ideal diode. Okay, so same concept, same idea. So if we have a forward bias or positive half cycle, so positive to positive, negative to negative, okay, so we have a complete loop with this one. So it will never pass through our V sub O. So as a result, our only voltage output is the voltage drop of this path or this node, wherein the voltage drop of this one is 0.7 volts. So again, you have to get the voltage drop of the diode or the voltage drop of the bias voltage. So in here, we only have a voltage drop of the diode. So we don't have the voltage drop of the bias voltage. So just put here 0. So as a result, 0.7 plus 0 is equal to 0.7 volts. So we have a minimum or a very minimal voltage output in positive half cycle. And then during the negative half cycle, okay, so again, even though, okay, this one is in, this one now is a silicon diode wherein it has now a threshold voltage because it's in negative half cycle or it's in reverse bias, okay, this one will become open circuit. So as a result, whatever is our V sub I will be always equal to our V sub O. Okay, so yeah, as you can see, this one is much more simpler when it comes to computing for the V sub O. Okay, so any questions so far regarding with the non-ideal example for the parallel positive clipper?
None, sir.
All right, so let's move on if there's no question. So now let's deal with positive or parallel positive clipper with bias. Okay, so again, this with bias is other two category. We have the positive bias and then the reverse, the negative bias. Sorry. So for the positive bias, we have this polarity for the, the bias voltage. And then for the reverse bias, we have this polarity. It's negative and then positive, and then positive and then negatives. It's the opposite. And then during the positive half cycle, okay, so this one for now, the positive bias. So during the positive half cycle, voltage output is equal to V sub D plus V sub D. Okay. So as you can see right here, if it's in forward bias, positive to positive, negative to negative, okay, if it's in forward bias, then we have a complete loop in here. Okay, so as you can see, if we have a complete loop, it will never pass through our V sub O. So our only voltage output is the voltage drop of the diode and then the voltage drop of the bias voltage or the bias voltage itself. Okay, so that's why we have V sub D plus V sub B. All right, and then during the negative bias, okay, in here. So the same idea, if it's in forward bias, then we have a complete loop in here. Okay, but instead of having VD plus V sub D, so just change this one into minus since the polarity of our bias voltage now is negative. So in here we have positive to positive. This one now is positive and then negative. Okay, that's why we have here negative VB. Right? So the same, we have to get the voltage drop of this diode. We have a forward bias here, and then the bias voltage itself. All right. So that's it for the positive half cycle. And then for the negative half cycle, we have here V sub O is equal to V sub I. So the same idea, no matter how many voltages you have inside of this node or inside of this path, since this one will become completely reverse bias. So V sub O is equal to V sub I. Okay. Negative, positive. Oops, one more thing I forgot to mention. So V sub I plus, let me just modify this one, plus V sub D. So if you're going to take a look on this one during the negative bias, so as you can see right here, negative to positive, positive to negative, so the complete reverse bias for the V sub I. But for the bias voltage, negative is connected to the N type or the negative of the diode, and then positive to positive. So this will make it a forward bias. Okay, so as you can see right here, if it's in forward bias or in the voltage of this bias voltage, so it will not conduct a current because this one is in forward bias. Okay. So again, as I mentioned a while ago, if it's in forward bias, it will not produce any voltage output. If it's in reverse bias, then that's the only time that it will produce a voltage output. And then as you can see right here, negative is connected to negative and then positive is connected to the positive. So this will make it a forward bias at a time of, at the maximum voltage of this bias voltage. So let's say we have a bias voltage of 2, then it will never conduct on that portion, on that forward bias. Okay, the only time that it will conduct is if our V sub I now is greater than the V sub B, wherein let's say -3 onwards. Okay. So -3 onwards, so our V sub I now is completely dominating our V sub B. So that's the only time that it will pass through our V sub O, because this one now is in reverse bias. Okay. So that is why we have this kind of graph here. Anyway, so for you to appreciate this one, we have here an example. So parallel positive clipper with positive bias, and then our diode is in ideal. So you're going to take a look at this one. Positive is connected to the positive, negative is connected to the negative. So completely forward bias. And then this one, okay, you're going to take a look at this one, the bias voltage. So we have here, why is it in RB? So this one should be BB. What about the others? All right, so let me just change this one real quick. VB. And ideal. All right. So again, during the positive half cycle, we have here positive to positive, negative to negative. And then the bias voltage is positive to negative and then negative to positive. Okay, so for the V sub I, it's in forward bias, meaning it will not be able to pass through our V sub O. And then for the bias voltage, we have here a reverse bias, wherein it will conduct a current during the maximum, positive or negative 1 volt. No, positive 1 volt and then positive 2 volts. Okay, because this will make this one completely reverse bias, wherein it will be able to pass through our V sub O. Okay, right here, and then going back to our power supply. So the formula for this one is VD plus V sub B. Okay, so VD is of course in ideal diode, so we have to put here 0. And then for VB, which is 2 volts, so you have to put here 2 volts. So it will conduct current at the maximum voltage of our VB, or at a maximum voltage of this circuit. So this one will become 2.7 if ever this one is non-ideal. But since this one is ideal, so your diode is 0. Okay, so as a result, we only have 2 volts for the positive half cycle. And then during the negative half cycle, we have here, what is it again in RB? Negative half cycle, VB. Sorry for that one. Let me just fix this one so that you guys won't get confused upon looking on the graph. There you go. So during the negative half cycle, negative is connected to the positive and then positive is connected to the negative. So it is completely in reverse bias. Okay, and then your bias voltage is positive connected to the negative and then negative connected to the positive. So this one is also completely in reverse bias. So either of those two, okay, since our V sub I, take a look on this one, V sub I is greater than V sub B. So as always, this one will become reverse bias, wherein this will never pass through our V sub O. Okay, so as a result, our only voltage that will pass through our V sub O is this V sub I. Okay, because this one is in open circuit. So V sub I is equal to V sub O, or V sub O is equal to V sub I. That's why we have here negative 5 volts. So completely, not completely actually. So we have here 2 volts. Okay, 2 volts for the positive half cycle, and then negative 5 during the negative half cycle. Okay. So any questions so far regarding with this or with this example, example number 15? Sure? What about the others?
None, sir.
So again, let me just clarify this one. If this one is in reverse bias, then all we have to answer. Okay, so all we have to this one, all you have to include or all you have to measure when it comes to voltage output is the V sub I, or the, let's say you have other voltage or a bias voltage in this part. So you have to add or deduct that one. But since this one is in reverse bias, so no matter how many voltages that is in here, then still it will not be able to pass through our V sub O. Anyway, so moving on, if we have ideal, we also have non-ideal. Okay, so before we have 0 plus 2, so right now we have 0.7 plus 2. Okay, so during the positive half cycle or the forward bias, so just get the voltage drop of this one. So 0.7 for the silicon diode, and then 2 volts for this. Why is it in RB? So let me just change this one. Ideal silicon diode. And this one is in positive half cycle. There you go. Okay. So as a result, we have a voltage output of 2.7 volts. So we only get the voltage drop of this one. And then during the reverse bias, so negative connected to the positive and then positive connected to the negative. So still, even though this one now is a silicon diode, okay, so this one now is an open circuit since our V sub I is always greater than V sub B. So as a result, we will get still negative 5 volts. So let me just change this one. Negative half cycle. There you go. Okay. All right, so now let's deal with positive taper with negative bias, and then our diode is in ideal. So take note, negative bias. So we have here negative and then positive. We already answered this one, negative, positive. This one is positive bias. This one is negative. Maybe. Yeah. Okay. So as you can see right here, it just changed the polarity of our bias voltage. So again, let me just change that one. So one is PB positive, negative bias. So the other way around, positive cycle. Silicon, this one will become ideal. All right, there you go. So this one now is the perfect graph for this one, perfect circuit. So positive, or during the positive half cycle, so positive is connected to the positive side and the negative is connected to the negative side. So this will make it a forward bias. And then for our bias voltage, we have here negative to negative and then positive to positive. So as you can see, our bias voltage is also making this one forward bias. Okay, so if it's forward bias, that it's completely having this loop, so it will never reach our V sub O because we have this loop in here. Okay, so as a result, if we have a complete forward bias, we are only dealing with the voltage drop of the voltages in here. Okay, so voltage drop of this diode and then the voltage drop or the bias voltage itself. Okay, so we have here V sub D minus V sub D. So for the diode, of course, it's 0 since it's in ideal, and then negative 2 volts for the bias voltage. So 0 minus 2 is negative 2 volts. Okay, so that's it for the positive half cycle. And then for the negative half cycle, we have negative to positive, positive to negative. Okay, and then as you can see right here, it's contradicting this one, wherein it will make this one a forward bias, wherein it will not conduct if it's in forward bias. So as a result, it will not conduct for the first -1 and then -2 voltage. Okay, so as you can see right here, this is now being deducted from our graph. So -1 will not conduct since this one is making it forward bias, and then -2 is also will not produce any voltages since it's making this diode a forward bias. Okay, so if this one now, V sub I is greater than V sub B, okay, then that's the only time that it will conduct a current. So -3 onwards. So -3, -4, and then -5. So yeah. And then still, since this one will become reverse bias, so our V sub O is -5 volts. So it will go directly to our V sub O, okay, because this one is open or a forward bias. Forward? Yeah, forward. Okay, so that's it for the example number 17. Do you guys have a question so far?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so again, I repeat. So as you can see right here, we have, or we don't conduct a current in here since this bias voltage will make this one forward bias, okay, for the first 2 volts. And then if we have non-ideal, if we have ideal, we also have non-ideal. So before this one is 0 minus 2. So right now you just have to put here 0.7. We're in to make it -1.3 volts. And then during the negative half cycle, so still the same, even though this one is a silicon diode, even though this one has a voltage threshold, this one will become a reverse bias anyway. So our voltage or our voltage input will now pass through our V sub O instead of this path. So still -5 volts. So -1.3 and then onwards up to -5 volts. Okay. So that's it for the parallel positive clipper with negative bias, which is non-ideal. So we don't have enough time anymore. So we will just finish this one next meeting. Anyway, I decided that to stop with the Clipper topic next meeting. So the remaining time will be used for your, for you to be able to finish the remaining activities that I will give. So I'll be giving a quiz on this one. So maybe